For today, we're going to see how do we solve equations by the method of factoring by grouping. Now, let's look at the first equation. Here they're asking us just to solve it. So, solve the equation to solve it. But how do we solve equations when we have four terms? You see, we have four terms here. 1, 2, 3, 4 terms. We have not seen tools that can give us the help to solve equations when we have four terms. So, when you have four terms, and you're solving, most likely you're going to be using factoring by grouping. Okay, so we're going to use factoring by grouping here because we have four terms and we want to solve. Now the question is, what is factoring by grouping? Okay, so factoring by grouping is you're going to look at your original equations and you're going to group them. You're going to look at the first two terms. I'm just going to rewrite the equation in different colors and I'm going to group them. So you see that the first two terms, I made a group. The first two terms, here's my first group. And now the last two terms, I'm going to make another group. That is equal to 0. So all I did, I just grouped them. I did not do anything fancy here. I look at the first two, I group them. I look at the last two, I group them, and I rewrote the equation. So now, what's the whole purpose of this? Okay. Now, once we have into this form, we're going to look at each group individually. So let's concentrate on the red group. We're going to look at the first group and we're going to see, can we factor anything out? Is there a greatest common factor that they have? Well, I see that in the red group, the greatest common factor is x squared. That's the greatest common thing that they have in common. So let me take out that x squared. So if I take out an x squared, what do I have left? I have 2x still, because if you multiply, you get 2x cubed minus 3. Because if I multiply, I get 3x squared. So all I did is group them, and I took out the greatest common factor. Now, what am I going to do now with the blue group? I'm going to do the same. So I'm going to look at it. Plus, what is the greatest common factor here? Well, the greatest common factor that I can see here is, what is that? 3. So let me factor out of 3. So if I factor out of 3, I'm going to have negative 2x. If I multiply, I get negative 6x. And then plus 2. 3. I'm sorry. Plus 3 equal to 0. Okay. So, this is a little bit tricky. Maybe this is not the first example, but the whole objective is to make sure you have the parentheses equal to each other. You see that they're almost equal to each other. You have 2x minus 3, and here you have negative 2x plus 3. Your objective is to make them look the same here. Okay? So now, what if I factor out a negative 3 instead of a 3? Let me factor out a negative 3. Because if I factor out a negative 3, I see that this becomes a plus, and I see that this becomes a minus. So now the parentheses are exactly equal to each other. 2x minus 3 on the red group, 2x minus 3 on the blue group. So this is my objective. Now I have them the same. So what do I do now? You're going to look at those which are on the outside, which in this case is x squared minus 3, and I'm going to group them. There's a lot of grouping here. So I'm going to group them. I'm going to get them x squared minus 3 as my first group. Or I'm going to factor them out. And then the other factor is what they have in common, which is the parentheses that they had in common, which is 2x minus 3 equals 0. So let's recap. I got 4. I made it into two groups. I look at each group individually. I took out the greatest common factor here. You need to make sure that the parentheses are equal to each other. 2x minus 3, 2x minus 3. And then you're going to get the outsides, group them like this. The insides, group them like this. So now we can solve this from a previous lesson. When you have two parentheses and they're equal to 0, you're going to set each parenthesis equal to 0. So I'm going to have x squared minus 3 equal to 0. And 2x minus 3 equal to 0. Okay, so let's solve individually. You add a 3 here. So x squared equals to 3. How do we solve this? You gotta take the square root. So take that square root. Not a perfect square, but it's fine. So our answer is plus or minus square root of 3. Okay, so now let's do the same here. So let's solve them. Plus 3, plus 3. So now I have 2x equals to 3 divided by 2. So I see that x equals to 3 halves. Alright, so let's conclude this. What are my solutions? After all this work, we came up with 3 solutions when x is equal to positive 3, positive square root of 3, when x equals negative square root of 3, and when x is equals to 3 halves. Okay. So yes, it's a lot of work. Yes. But why is it a lot of work? Because we start with 4 terms. So now, let's do another example. I feel like this kind of stuff, you will understand it just by example. So now, if we look at the second example, we're going to try and do the same here. 4 terms, they're equal to each other. As of right now, we only know one way to solve them, and that is by grouping. So let's do the same. Let's group them out. Let me get the first 2, and let me group them. So I'm just going to rewrite it in a different color, so you can have the distinction here. So x squared minus 4x squared. Now I'm just going to group them plus the other 2. 3x minus 12 equal to 0. Okay, so I group them. I have not done anything to the equation. I just grouped them. Now, let's look at the red expression here, or the red group. What is the greatest common factor here? What is the greatest thing that I can factor it out? Well, I see that I can factor out an x squared. So I can rewrite the red group as x squared, x minus 4, plus, let's see, what is the greatest common factor on the second group? Well, I see that I can factor out a 3. So 3 x minus 4 equal to 0. Okay, so what do you notice now? Do we have to make any changes here? Nope, they have the same parentheses, so we're okay. So now our second step is to look at the outsides and factor them out, or make them into a group. So now we have x squared plus 3 parentheses multiplication x minus 4 equal to 0. Now that we have this multiplication, now that we have it into this form, what do? You're gonna set each of those parentheses equal to 0, just like we did on the previous lesson. So let's finish it off here. So now we're gonna have 2 equations to solve: x squared minus 2, x squared plus 3 equals to 0, and x minus 4 equals 0. Okay. So now let's solve it individually. So minus 3. So we have that x squared is equal to minus 3. Now again, how do we solve this? We take the square root. So we have that our answer is, before we reveal the answer, you gotta remember in Algebra 1, you cannot take the square root of a negative number. So let's look at our calculator. What is the square root of negative 3? It's an error. It's non-real. So right now, we want our answers to be real. So you cannot take the square root of a negative number. So here, we just want real numbers. We're going to talk about what happens when you take the square root of negative numbers, which is called complex numbers, in the future. So at least in the first equation, there's no solution here. or let's be specific, there is no real solution because you cannot take the square root of a negative number. So at least in the first equation, we have no real solutions. Now let's look at the second equation. So let's solve it just like we did previously. So, okay. So as a conclusion here, what is my only solution? We just have one solution. And our only solution is when x equals to 4. That's all. Because in our first equation, we to take the square root of a negative number. We don't need that. No real solution. So the only solution that is left is x equals to 4. Okay. Let's look at one last example here. Again, when you have 4 terms and you've been asked to solve, your go-to method is factor by grouping. So look at the first 2 terms, x cubed minus 3x squared. Let's group them. So x cubed minus 3a squared plus, let's look at the second group, 5a minus 15. So 5a minus 15 equal to 0. Okay. Look at the first group. What is the greatest common factor? What is the greatest thing that you can factor it out? I can factor out a squared. So a squared equals to a minus 3 plus, what is the greatest thing that you can factor out here? Again, this looks like a 15, but it's a 5. Yeah, I mean, I can factor out a 5. So let's factor out 5. So 5, parentheses, what is left? A minus 3 equal to 0. Okay, so we're good. Do we have this in parentheses? Yes, we do. A minus 3, a minus 3. So now we're good. So now, let's see, how do we solve this? Look at those numbers which are on the outside. A squared and 5. Put them together. So we're going to have a solution, or at least the next step is a squared plus 5. First group, second group, a minus 3 equals to 0. Okay, so just like we did in the previous lesson, 2 multiplications equal to 0. You just said each multiplication equal to 0. So let's finish it off here. So we're going to have a squared plus 5 equal to 0. That's our first group. And a minus 3 equal to 0. Okay, so let's solve it individually. Let's look at the first equation. So minus 5 here. So a squared equals to minus 5. Pretty sure you're already spotting the error here. So how do we solve it? You want a, take the square root. Again, we're taking that a is equal to square root of negative 5. We cannot have negative square roots, so this is a no real solution. And right now we want real numbers. We'll talk about what happens when you take the square root of a negative number later on. So I see that the first equation I have no real solution, so let me see if I can get a real solution from the second equation. So plus 3. So plus 3. So I see that a is equal to 3. Good. So let's summarize it all now. So I only have one solution, and that is when a is equal to 3. I will post some videos about how do we factor it out, like the idea of factoring out. Now, this is a skill that we saw in Algebra 1. Maybe you need a refresher, which is all okay. I'm going to post a help video underneath this link. Okay, so this is all for today. Here's your entrance ticket. Again, oh, I guess I forgot to write this out. So here's your entrance ticket. Basically, all I'm asking you is just to solve. So entrance ticket, let's put a frame here. Solve the following. Try to solve the following equation just like we did on the previous example. So the method that you're going to be doing here is factor by grouping. So here's your entrance ticket. I'll see you tomorrow.